My name is Evan Marlowe. I'm 37 years old, born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska. I've spent most of my life being the smartest person in the room and the last one people expect to hear from. I don't say that with arrogance, it's just a fact. When you grow up with a port wine birthmark covering half your face, people make decisions about you before you even speak. Kids stared, teachers hesitated, adults offered sympathy I didn't ask for. Eventually, I stopped trying to be seen and focused on being heard through numbers, through code, through things that didn't care what I looked like. I studied software engineering at Iowa State, graduated early, and went straight into the world of product development. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't loud, but I delivered. Always. 5 years ago, I moved to Denver, took a job at a mid-sized tech firm, and within months I was leading development on one of the most promising internal products the company had touched in a decade. It wasn't luck. I lived in that code. I slept with whiteboards full of architecture sketches. I didn't care about office politics, Friday lunches, or ping-pong tables in the break room. I cared about the thing we were building. And it was working. 6 months ago, our VP pulled me aside and told me the company was considering spinning our project into a full-scale product line, complete with investor backing. That meant funding, growth, expansion, everything we dreamed of when we started. I didn't smile, I didn't celebrate. I just nodded. I knew it wasn't done yet. I still had more to tighten, more to prove. For the next 4 months, I buried myself in work, building the prototype into something real, refining the pitch deck, compiling user data, running late-night tests on server load handling. No one knew that system better than I did. Hell, I was the system. When we got the calendar invite for the investor presentation, my name was there, third on the list. That made sense. Our director would lead, our product manager would speak second, and I'd be there to talk tech, scalability, and projections. I didn't care about the spotlight. I just wanted to protect the thing we built. My section was short, 12 minutes, but I rehearsed it like my life depended on it. I knew the material better than anyone, and I had the numbers to back every claim. The company was depending on us to close this funding round, and I wasn't going to let my team down. Then, 2 days before the meeting, the update hit my inbox. A simple change to the invite. My name was gone. No subject line. No explanation, just a new version with me quietly erased. I checked it 3 times, refreshed the page, thought maybe it was a glitch in the system. I messaged the coordinator. No answer. I waited a few hours, then stopped by her desk. She wasn't there. I asked our project manager, and he just shrugged. "I'm sure it's nothing," he mumbled, not quite meeting my eyes. That's when I felt it, that slow, familiar tightening in my chest. The one that told me something wasn't right and wouldn't be. By evening, the silence was louder than any reply. No one brought it up. No one said a word. I sat at my desk long after everyone else had gone home, staring at the timeline I'd built, the test results I'd verified, the design documents I'd written, everything with my name on it. My work, my idea, my system. And somehow, they decided I wasn't the right person to speak about it. I knew why. I didn't want to believe it, but I wasn't naive. I'd seen the glances investors gave when I sat in on earlier meetings, the polite smiles, the way they looked at my face for half a second too long before shifting their gaze to the person next to me. In high school, I learned to read people before they spoke. It was a survival skill. You learn fast when every stranger's eyes carry a question they don't have the courage to ask. I knew when I was being measured, judged, calculated as a risk. Somewhere, someone in the company had decided my face wasn't worth the gamble, that I might distract, that I didn't represent the brand image. No one would say it directly, of course. That would be discrimination. Instead, they just made me disappear quietly, with no scene, no confrontation, just a revised calendar. Invite. I closed my laptop slowly, breathing through my nose, letting the quiet fill the space where anger wanted to live. I wasn't angry, I was focused, not surprised, just alert. If they were going to cut me out of the moment we'd all worked for, they'd better be damn sure I wasn't holding anything they needed. The problem was, I was holding everything, and I wasn't letting go. The next morning I walked into the office earlier than usual. The building was mostly quiet, lights still flickering on floor by floor, the kind of silence that only exists before corporate energy infects the walls. I didn't turn on my computer right away. I sat in the dark for a while, letting the hum of the servers behind me fill the room. I kept thinking maybe someone would say something. Maybe there had been a mistake, an oversight they'd acknowledge with a sheepish grin and a quick correction. But by 9 CE, the inbox was still silent. No apologies. No reinstated invites. Nothing. Around 9:40, I saw her walk past, Nora, the HR liaison. She didn't notice me at first. She was headed straight toward our director's office with a folder in hand and that calculated look she always wore when something uncomfortable needed to be done discreetly. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. When she stepped back out and saw me sitting there, her eyes did a small dance, just a flicker, like she hadn't expected to be caught in the open. She changed direction, stopped by my desk, and asked if we could talk. She said it casually, like we were discussing logistics or PTO balances. I followed her to one of the glass conference rooms on the far side of the floor. It's strange, being brought into a room you've walked past 100 times and suddenly realizing it's been assigned a different purpose. The light was too bright. The air felt thinner. I sat across from her and waited. She didn't open the folder right away. She started with small talk, asked about the project, about the team, about how I'd been feeling lately. I knew the game. She wasn't warming up to me. She was warming herself up to deliver something uncomfortable in a way that felt just short of offensive. Finally, she looked down at the folder and said the words that landed like a whisper coated in acid. She said it wasn't personal. She said I had done excellent work. She said everyone agreed my technical leadership was a huge part of why the product was viable, but there were considerations at play, factors beyond just performance. The investor meeting, she explained, was highly visual. The room would be filled with people who made quick decisions based on instinct, brand alignment, presence. She used vague language, HR-safe phrasing. She said certain appearances might shift the room's dynamic. She said I should understand. You know how these things work. I didn't respond, not immediately. I looked past her, through the glass wall, watching people at their desks pretending not to notice I was in there. The ones who knew me looked away quickly when our eyes met. I felt like I was on display, like someone had painted a red target around my face and told the whole floor not to mention it. I turned back to Nora, and she was still talking. She said it was a strategic decision, that I should take it as a compliment that my work was strong enough to stand on its own without me having to be present, that I was still an asset, just not the right face for the room. My throat tightened, not from anger but from restraint. I wanted to speak, to correct her, to ask if she heard herself. But there was something else pulsing in the air. Shame, not mine, hers. She didn't believe what she was saying. She was delivering it like a memo she hadn't written, one passed down from someone higher up, probably our director or the PR team. She was just the messenger, and maybe that made it worse, because no one had the guts to say it to my face. Not directly. They used her. They wrapped it in corporate language and hoped I'd swallow it like medicine. I thought about all. The hours I'd spent perfecting the architecture, the nights I hadn't gone home, the weekends I'd skipped. The fact that the first time our system ran flawlessly under max load was at 3:12 a.m. on a Sunday, and I was the only one in the building. That the feature set that closed our first beta client was one I built in 48 hours straight while everyone else was on retreat. And now, when it mattered most, when the thing I'd built was ready to stand in front of the people who could decide its future, I was being asked to step aside because someone decided my face might shift the room's dynamic. She didn't ask me if I was okay with it. She didn't offer options. Just a quiet, "thank you for understanding," as she slid the folder toward me. It was a revised deck for the investor meeting, stripped of my section. The tech overview had been condensed. The slides I created were still there, but my name had been replaced. No attribution, no voice. Just the work, disembodied and repackaged through someone else's mouth. When I left the room, the hallway felt longer than usual. Every step back to my desk echoed louder than it should have. People didn't meet my eyes. They didn't have. I could feel it, something between discomfort and guilt hanging in the air like static. I sat down, stared at my monitor for a while, then opened the old invite. My name had really been there once, third on the list, just under the product manager. I clicked Restore Previous Version just to see it again. It didn't matter. It wasn't coming back. But something had shifted in me. Not rage. Not even betrayal. Just clarity. A cold kind of stillness that spread through my chest and made everything else go quiet. They didn't want me in that room. They thought they could extract my work and discard the rest. That they could take the brain and amputate the face. And maybe they could. But they forgot something. I was still holding the source files. The day before the presentation, the energy in the office shifted. There was a forced excitement in the air, the kind that masks tension just under the surface. People were moving faster. Voices were a bit too loud. Laughter too rehearsed. It was the sound of a company pretending it was ready, hoping no one would notice what it had left behind. I stayed quiet. I kept my headphones on most of the day, not to listen to music, but to block the noise of a celebration I wasn't invited to. They didn't say it, but everyone knew. I had been removed. Quietly. Efficiently. And now they were rehearsing the future without me in it. Mid-afternoon, I got a message from Victor, our director. It was brief, asking me to sit in on a final prep session. No explanation, no apology. Just a line about alignment before tomorrow. I knew what it was. They needed last-minute clarification on something I'd built. Some detail the others hadn't quite grasped, some number they couldn't defend without me. So I walked down the corridor to the big conference room, the one with the glass wall and the expensive projector setup, where the main team was already seated. I opened the door and stepped in. They didn't stop talking when I entered. That was new. Normally they'd greet me, acknowledge me, sometimes even wait for me to get settled before resuming. But not this time. They just kept going, eyes flicking in my direction for a split second before returning to their papers, their laptops, their well-practiced tones. Victor stood at the head of the table, running through the order of speaking points. The product manager, Callie, was testing her delivery, trying to explain technical architecture she barely understood. She had bullet points. I had written the system. I took a seat near the wall, not at the table. There was no chair left there, and no one offered to make room. I didn't ask. I just listened. I watched. I kept my expression neutral, hands still, eyes calm. Inside, something else was happening. They were using my slides, my diagrams, my metrics. Callie was stumbling through a section about back-end resilience, trying to explain how the system scaled under high concurrency load. She butchered the terminology, misquoted the server limits. I didn't correct her. I wasn't asked to. I wasn't there to speak. I was there, apparently, to nod if needed. Then came the Q&A section. Victor played the part of a skeptical investor, throwing questions around the room. Most of them were softballs, generic things about growth strategy, retention plans, team composition. But one landed hard. He asked about security protocols, how the system handled sensitive data at rest versus in motion. Callie hesitated, looked down at her notes, then looked at me. It wasn't a full turn, not a direct plea, but a flicker of helplessness behind her eyes. She didn't know. She had memorized the line about end-to-end encryption, but she couldn't elaborate, couldn't explain how we handled token rotation or secure access layers or the failover redundancy we'd spent 3 weeks perfecting. Still, I didn't speak. Victor gave her a lifeline, moved on quickly, pretending not to notice the stumble. The room relaxed again, but not completely. That crack had shown something. I watched them recover, watched them reset their composure like actors between takes. And I sat there, the ghost in the room, the one they didn't want visible but couldn't quite erase. I was no longer a contributor. I was a backup drive plugged in only when necessary, then quietly tucked away again. After an hour, the meeting ended. People filed out. There were congratulations, low fives, nervous laughter. Someone joked about investor swag, about impressing the suits. I stood slowly, waited until the room was almost empty, then approached the display where my diagrams were, still frozen on screen. I looked at them, clean, concise, mine. I remembered the late nights drawing them, the revisions, the way I'd tested them again and again to make sure every visual told the right story. They had taken my work, removed my name, and handed it off to someone who couldn't even pronounce half the acronyms. I walked back to my desk through the open floor, where people were pretending not to watch me walk past. That's what people do when shame is in the air. They pretend. They tap harder on their keyboards, they check Slack threads that haven't updated in an hour. They create noise to drown out their own silence. I sat down, opened a folder on my desktop labeled Redundancy, and checked the version logs. Everything was intact. The source files, the architecture notes, the roadmap projections, the code, the pitch deck I had written before marketing got their hands on it. Everything still lived with me. That night, I stayed late again. The lights dimmed one by one as the office emptied. I listened to the hum of machines, to the quiet breathing of a place that still didn't know what it had done. I wasn't angry. Anger fades. This was something else, something colder. They had removed my voice, but not my value. They thought they could separate the face from the function. They didn't realize they'd just made their biggest dependency invisible. I didn't go home right after I shut my laptop that night. I stayed in the office long after the building was quiet again, after the cleaning crew had passed through and the elevators had stopped humming. I sat in the dark, staring out at the Denver skyline through tinted glass, thinking about everything I hadn't said, everything I wasn't allowed to say, and everything they thought I'd just accept. I wasn't surprised anymore, just methodical. When you've been excluded your whole life for something you can't control, you stop reacting emotionally. You learn to think, to plan, to act. Not out of spite, out of self-preservation. It didn't take long to find what I needed. My old external drive was still in my bag, an old habit I'd never dropped. On it I had backups of the original project structure, early architecture plans, technical briefs, even recorded dev meetings where I'd walked the team through key system elements that had never made it into the documentation. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I never assumed anyone else would care enough to archive what mattered. I cared, and that's why I had it. I spent the next 2 hours compiling a clean version of the original deck, the one I'd written before the marketing team stripped it for buzzwords. I made sure the charts were accurate, the code references correct, the security breakdown precise. I added notes, annotations, context. I didn't embellish anything. I didn't need. The truth was strong enough on its own. Then I opened my contacts. I hadn't spoken to Mark Willis in over a year, not since he'd left our company to join a venture capital firm based out of San Francisco. He had always been straight with me, one of the few who had seen past the surface and focused on the work. When he left, he said I had a gift for systems thinking, that I saw the architecture like a living thing. I never told him, but that stuck with me. Made me believe I was building more than code. I was building something that mattered. His name was on the investor list. I had seen it when the meeting agenda circulated 2 weeks ago. I hadn't planned to use that connection. I didn't believe in shortcuts and I didn't like trading on past favors. But this wasn't about ego anymore. It was about integrity. They had taken my voice from the room. I wasn't going to beg for it back. I was going to speak somewhere else. I wrote the email carefully. No bitterness, no accusations, just the facts. I told him the core architecture of the system had been built under my leadership, that I had created the product vision and implemented the back end that powered the whole thing. I told him I had been removed from the presentation and that I believed the investors deserved to hear directly from the person who had built what they were being asked to fund. I attached the revised deck, my contact information, and a short video I'd recorded from my desk explaining the high-level architecture in my own words. I hovered over the send button longer than I expected. Not because I was uncertain, but because I understood what this meant. There would be no undoing this. I wasn't sabotaging the company, I wasn't leaking secrets, but I was asserting my place in the narrative they had tried to erase me from. I clicked send. The moment the message left my outbox, a strange calm settled over me. Not peace exactly, but finality. I packed up my bag, turned off the last lamp, and walked to the parking lot. The air was cold, sharp in my lungs. The streets were empty. I drove home in silence. The next morning, I didn't go to the office. I worked remotely under the pretense of finalizing support documentation, but really, I just didn't want to watch them put on their suits and prep themselves to pitch my work. I checked my inbox every hour. Nothing. I told myself not to expect anything. Mark was busy. He might not even open it until after the presentation, or at all. But deep down, I knew him. He wasn't the kind of man who ignored a message like that. At 2:17 p.m., my phone buzzed. Unknown number. California area code. I stared at it until it stopped ringing. Then it rang again. And again. 3 missed calls. I didn't answer. Not yet. I sat at my kitchen table, hands folded, heartbeat steady. I didn't need to speak. I had already said everything that mattered. Instead, I opened my email. There it was. 1 sentence. I read it 3 times. Then I closed the laptop. Whatever happened next, I knew the silence was over. They thought I was gone. They thought I'd sit quietly while they pitched a version of something I created without the creator. But now someone else knew the truth. And someone who mattered was listening. I wasn't in the room when it happened, but I didn't need to be. I've been in enough meetings, heard enough recaps, seen enough body language to reconstruct the entire thing in my head with excruciating clarity. The room was polished, sleek, floor to ceiling. Windows, bottled water lined up like soldiers. A long oak table that made everyone feel a little smaller than they were used to. Suits everywhere, jackets crisp, smiles pinned on like name tags. Our company's delegation arrived rehearsed and overly confident, all performance and posture. They had their clicker, their slide deck, their 3-person rotation. They'd trimmed the story for time, shaved off the edges, made it palatable for people who wanted results, not details. Callie opened the pitch. I know her pacing. Slow start, then ramp up. Her voice always tightens when she senses power in the room. Victor probably chimed in on market positioning, throwing in some buzzwords about disruption and user retention. I can imagine the nods, the affirmations, the subtle but telling glances between investors trying to gauge whether they were hearing something real or another polished fantasy. It was going smoothly on the surface, until the questions began. That's where things tend to shift. Mark was never one to dominate the room. He wasn't loud or theatrical, but when he spoke, it carried. His questions were surgical, sharp, precise, the kind that sliced through rehearsed narratives. So when he raised his hand and asked about the data isolation protocol used in the system's multi-tenant structure, the room stalled. I know the moment they looked at each other, searching, faces for an answer that wasn't coming. It's not a question you anticipate, unless you lived inside the code. Unless you remember the late-night session where the existing model failed and had to be rebuilt from scratch because it allowed one client's data to bleed into another's, under certain rare concurrency conditions. That solution hadn't been pretty. It had been painful, messy, and very specific, and I was the only one who had truly understood it. There would have been a pause, a long one. Victor might have tried to pass it off with a generalization, something like, "We follow best practices," or "We're aligned with industry standards." But Mark wouldn't have moved on. He never did. And the next question came right after. How exactly does the system handle fault tolerance across asynchronous microservices when one service experiences latency, but no failure? That question was mine. I'd spent days debating that architecture internally, building in circuit breakers, writing fallback mechanisms, using message queues with delay logic so the entire system wouldn't collapse under strain from a single, weak node. Callie wouldn't know the answer. She barely understood the question. I'd walked her through it once, in layman's terms, but she hadn't retained it. Not because she wasn't smart, but because it wasn't hers. It was mine. I imagined the way her voice must have faltered, how the others glanced at their hands, their screens, their water bottles, how they pivoted. I could picture Victor clearing his throat, throwing a question back at the investors to regain control, a classic deflection. But the damage had been done. They had entered that room thinking they could carry the weight of the product without the person who built it, and the moment they were asked to go deeper than the slide deck, they started to sink. Later that day, I got a message from one of the junior developers who had been helping prep the materials. He didn't say much, just a single line about the presentation feeling off, and that there were some uncomfortable moments. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. I knew how it looked, how it felt. I could see their faces. In my mind, the subtle shift from confidence to confusion to quiet panic. I kept thinking about the questions Mark asked. They weren't random. He could have asked anything, something easier, something that let the team keep their narrative clean. But he chose those because he wanted to know if I was present, if I was in the room, not physically but in the work. And he knew the moment they stumbled that I wasn't. He'd read my email, watched the video. He had seen the lines I drew, the systems I described, the context only I could provide. And when those answers didn't show up in the room, he knew exactly why. I imagined him sitting back in his chair, folding his hands, watching, not speaking, not reacting, just observing. Investors don't need to yell. They just need to listen, to wait for the mask to slip. And in that room, with all their polish and practice, the mask didn't just slip. It cracked. That night, as I sat on my balcony with a glass of water and the city lights blinking silently, in the distance I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt still, heavy but still, like something had settled. They had gone into that room thinking they could control the story, but stories have a way of bending back toward the truth. And when the truth walks out of the room, people notice the silence it leaves behind. They thought I was a liability. They thought my presence would make people uncomfortable. But the only discomfort came when I wasn't there to answer the question. It was 2 days after the presentation when the call came. I hadn't been back to the office. I hadn't checked in, hadn't responded to messages, hadn't opened Slack or answered any internal emails. I wasn't interested in small talk or damage control. I knew enough. I knew how the room had turned. I knew the silence that followed had weight. That weight belonged to me now. I didn't need to ask what happened. I could feel the shape of it and how quiet things had become. There's a particular stillness after exposure, the kind that wraps around people who realize they've been pretending to hold more than they do. The team had tried to move forward without the foundation, and the cracks had spread faster than they expected. I was sitting at my kitchen table when the phone rang. The caller ID showed the company name. I let it ring twice before answering. I already knew the voice on the other end. Victor. His tone was different this time, stripped of its usual polish. He didn't talk like a man calling to reprimand or redirect. He talked like someone trying to recover control of a narrative he no longer owned. He danced around it at first as if I hadn't noticed what had happened. He mentioned the meeting, said it went mostly well, but there had been some confusion around a few of the technical aspects. He said the investors had asked some unexpectedly deep questions and that some of the language didn't quite land. He paused a lot, left long silences he hoped I would fill. I didn't. I let him sit in the gaps. Eventually, he asked if I'd be open to clarifying a few things. Then he asked if I could come in for a follow-up conversation. Nothing official, just to realign. He said it like a peace offering, but it felt like a salvage mission. I knew what had happened. They'd built a version of the story without me, and when the questions cut too deep, their version collapsed. Now they needed the original author to stitch the pages back together. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't promise anything. I hung up and sat still for a while, watching light move across the floor, tracing slow patterns like time itself was shifting shape. It would have been easy to say yes. To walk back into the building, be the bigger person, clean up their mess, restore the project's credibility. But I didn't move right away. I wasn't angry, not anymore. What I felt was something quieter, something heavier and more final. Not closure exactly, just a decision taking root. Later that afternoon, I got another message, this time from Mark. It was short. He said he'd spoken with the rest of the investment group and that they were still interested in the product, but under different terms. He didn't say much more, just that he'd be in touch soon with options. That was all I needed. To know the terms had shifted, and so had the power. The next day, I received an official request from the legal team, asking me to verify authorship on certain technical documentation. There was a nervous energy to it. A quiet plea hidden under formal language. I knew what was happening behind the scenes. Meetings, questions, doubts, recalculations. The cracks were spreading into the structure now, not just the presentation. Without me, they didn't have the blueprint. They had a product they couldn't fully explain, a system they couldn't defend under scrutiny, and a partner network that now had questions about who really built what. That evening, I got another call. This time from someone higher up, one of the VPs I'd only spoken to once during an all-hands years ago. He didn't waste time. He said they wanted to offer me a new role, not a return to the team, not a silent reintegration, a leadership position, full technical oversight, my own department, autonomy. They used words like reconciliation and moving forward. I let him speak. Then I asked one question. Would my name be on everything this time? He paused, then said yes. I didn't accept right away. I needed to feel what that offer meant. Not just the title or the salary or the gesture, but what it meant to have been erased and then acknowledged again, not because I demanded it, but because they had no choice. That kind of recognition doesn't come with words. It comes with silence broken by consequence. In the days that followed, the company began quietly updating records. Documents were amended, slides replaced, emails circulated with my name reattached. To work that had been stripped bare. There were no public apologies, but I didn't need them. The truth had moved through the walls like smoke, and everyone inside had breathed it. They knew. I did return eventually. Not for them, for the product. For the thing I had built from nothing that still deserved a future. I walked through the lobby differently this time. Not with pride or ego, but with clarity. People looked up. Some smiled, some looked away. I didn't care. I wasn't there for their comfort. The project moved forward. The investors stayed on board. I led the rebuild, quietly, precisely, as always. My name was printed on the launch materials, not in bold, not highlighted, just there, where it always should have been. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive as fire, or noise or vengeance. Sometimes it comes as a phone call from the very place that once chose silence. And when it does, you don't need to raise your voice, because they already heard it when you weren't in the room.